In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 alien species bow to the might of the Hegemony Council, there exists an unwritten rule. The weak serve, the strong command. And humans, well, humans are still figuring out where they fit. But what happens when an ancient albino dwarf dragon, the last of a proud lineage, suffers the ultimate humiliation at alien hands, only to catch the attention of someone whose father once made entire star systems tremble? Some mistakes echo across the void. Some insults demand blood. And some humans carry more than just their father's name. They carry his wrath. The galaxy is about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon isn't technology, tactics, or even courage. It's something far more dangerous. Loyalty to those who can't defend themselves, and the unbreakable will to make things right, no matter the cost. Welcome to a story where honor isn't just a word. Revenge isn't just a dish best served cold. It's served with the precise, calculated fury that only a human can deliver. The crystalline halls of the Nexus trading station gleamed under artificial starlight, their surfaces reflecting the chittering, slithering, and walking forms of 100 different species conducting business across the galaxy's most prestigious commercial hub. Merchants from the Yearland Confederacy clicked their mandibles in heated negotiation with the Serpentine Stack Collective, while Breton diplomats floated in their environmental suits, conducting deals worth entire solar systems. At the center of it all, in the station's grand auction hall, a crowd had gathered, not for rare minerals or ancient artifacts, but for something far more disturbing to those who still remembered when honor meant something in this corner of space. Zephyr crouched on the cold metal platform, his alabaster scales catching the harsh overhead lights in a way that made him appear almost ghostly. The albino dwarf dragon's small frame, barely the size of a large dog, trembled not from fear, but from barely contained rage. Golden chains, inscribed with suppression runes, bound his limbs and wrapped around his snout, preventing him from speaking or breathing the sacred flame that was his birthright. Lot 347, announced Kravik, the station's head auctioneer, his purple Vorthen hide glistening with excitement. One genuine draconic pygmy, subspecies Albus ruridus, last confirmed member of the white-scale lineage. Fully domesticated, ideal for entertainment purposes, collection display, or exotic cuisine preparation. A ripple of laughter swept through the crowd. The Hegemony Council had made it clear decades ago that the smaller draconic species were no longer considered sentient beings worthy of protection under interstellar law. They were curiosities now, pets for the wealthy, trophies for the powerful. Zephyr's golden eyes burned with ancient fury as bidders raised their appendages, tentacles, and mechanical interfaces. He had once been Prince Zephyr of the White-Scale Court, heir to knowledge spanning millennia, keeper of songs that could call forth storms, and wisdom that could humble gods. Now he was chattel, a thing to be bought and sold by creatures whose ancestors had crawled in mud while his lineage ruled the stars. The bidding was spirited. A Breton collector offered 50,000 credits. A Yearland merchant raised it to 75. A fat Gorlan trader, his multiple chins wobbling with greed, pushed it to 100,000. 100,000 going once, Kravik called out, his voice carrying across the hall's excellent acoustics. Going twice. 500,000 credits. The voice cut through the auction hall like a plasma blade through paper. Every head, sensor, and optical apparatus turned toward the source, a figure that had appeared seemingly from nowhere in the back of the crowd. She stood with the casual confidence that marked her as either supremely dangerous or supremely naive. Neither tall nor short by human standards, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made veteran warriors take notice. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple tactical style, and her clothing was unremarkable civilian, where that somehow managed to look like a uniform on her frame. But it was her eyes that made the room suddenly quieter, pale blue, cold as vacuum, and holding the kind of steady gaze that had stared death in the face, and found it wanting. "I'm sorry," Kravik stammered, his purple hide shifting to a nervous orange. "Did you say 500,000? That seems excessive for a simple pet. The human woman walked forward, the crowd parting before her like water. Each step was measured, purposeful, carrying the weight of someone who had learned to move through hostile territory without broadcasting threat while remaining ready for violence at any moment. I said 500,000, she repeated, her voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. Credit transfer is ready for immediate processing. On his platform, Zephyr felt something shift in the air around him. This human moved differently than the others he'd observed. There was no casual cruelty in her stance, no predatory hunger in her expression. Instead, he sensed something that had become alien to him in his months of captivity: respect. Kravik looked around the hall nervously. The other bidders were backing away, some literally retreating to the exit. Those who remained watched with the fascination of scavengers, waiting to see what would be left after the predators finished. 500,000 credits to the human female. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel came down with unusual haste. The woman approached the platform where Zephyr crouched in his chains. Up close, he could see the small scars that marked her hands and face, not the random marks of accident or misfortune, but the precise signatures of blade work and energy burns that spoke of professional violence. When she looked at him, he saw none of the casual dismissal he'd grown accustomed to from his captors. "My name is Sarah Chun," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone while the transaction completed around them. "I'm here to buy your freedom, not your servitude." Zephyr's eyes widened. The words were spoken in perfect High Draconic, a language that hadn't been heard in public spaces for over a century. More than that, she'd used the formal register reserved for addressing royalty. "The chains will come off as soon as we're clear of station authority," she continued in the same ancient tongue. "You have my word as the daughter of General Marcus Chun of the Terran Defense Corps." The name hit Zephyr like a physical blow. Even in the depths of his captivity, even after the fall of his people, he knew that name. Every sentient being in the galaxy knew that name. Marcus Chun, the Terran dreadnought, the human hurricane, the man who had held the Zinthari advance at Beta Centauri for 6 months with nothing but a single battalion and what the humans called pure spite. The man whose tactical innovations had become required study in military academies across 12 species. The man whose very existence had forced the galaxy to reconsider its casual dismissal of human capabilities. "Your father's reputation precedes you," Zephyr whispered in High Draconic, his voice barely audible through the runic suppression of his vocal cords. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those cold blue eyes. "My father taught me that honor isn't about strength. It's about how you treat those who can't defend themselves. He also taught me that some insults demand satisfaction." Around them, the transaction completed with the sterile efficiency of galactic commerce. Credits transferred, ownership papers exchanged hands, and Zephyr found himself legally the property of a human he'd never met who spoke his language and invoked names that still carried weight in the darker corners of space. As they left the auction hall, Zephyr caught sight of the other traders and collectors watching their departure with expressions ranging from confusion to calculation. More than one was already reaching for communication devices, no doubt to report this unusual transaction to interested parties. The purchase of a dwarf dragon by an unknown human for 10 times its market value was exactly the kind of irregularity that intelligence services love to investigate. Sarah seemed unconcerned by the attention. She moved through the station's corridors with the easy navigation of someone who had studied the layouts beforehand, leading them toward the docking bays with purpose. Zephyr, still bound but no longer on display, felt a strange sensation he hadn't experienced in months: hope. "Where are we going?" he asked in High Draconic as they entered a lift that would take them to the station's private berth section. "Somewhere we can talk privately," Sarah replied. "And where I can get those chains off you without triggering station security. The runic suppressions will take some work to disable safely." The lift carried them through the station's superstructure, past levels dedicated to luxury accommodations, restricted research facilities, and, finally, to the private docking bays where the galaxy's most exclusive vessels waited for their owners. Sarah led him to Bay 94, where a sleek Corvette-class ship sat berthed like a coiled snake ready to strike. The ship was human design, but modified with technology Zephyr didn't recognize. Its hull bore no markings save for a small registration number, but its weapon hardpoints were occupied by systems that definitely weren't standard civilian equipment. This wasn't a merchant vessel or even a typical private craft. This was a warship pretending to be something harmless. "Welcome aboard the Retribution," Sarah said as the airlock cycled them through. She's not much to look at, but she's fast, well-armed, and most importantly, her sensor suite can detect hostile intent from 3 systems away. Inside, the ship was Spartanly functional. Military-grade equipment filled spaces where civilian vessels would have held comfort amenities. The bridge was designed for a crew of 1, with backup systems that could run automatically if needed. Everything spoke of a vessel designed for someone who expected to operate alone in hostile territory. Sarah led him to a small but well-equipped workbench and began examining the runic chains that bound him. "These are Yearlin work," she observed, running scanners over the inscribed metal. Suppression runes keyed to draconic neural patterns. "Clever, but not unbreakable." "You seem remarkably well-informed about draconic physiology," Zephyr noted, watching her work with growing surprise. Most species, humans included, knew virtually nothing about how dragon abilities actually functioned. "My father made a point of learning about every species in the galaxy that the Hegemony Council had written off as extinct or irrelevant," Sarah replied, her attention focused on the intricate runic patterns. "He believed that understanding your allies was just as important as understanding your enemies. Perhaps more important." She produced a small device that hummed with contained energy. "This is going to feel strange, but it shouldn't hurt. The runes need to be discharged in sequence, or they'll feed back into your nervous system." The process took nearly an hour. Each runic link had to be carefully neutralized before the physical chain could be removed, and the suppression field around his snout required even more delicate work. But eventually, the last of the golden chains fell away, clattering to the deck like dead things. Zephyr stretched his wings for the first time in months. Feeling sensation returned to limbs that had been magically numbed. He worked his jaw, testing his ability to speak freely, and then did something he hadn't been able to do since his capture. He breathed fire. It was only a small flame, barely enough to light a candle, but it was his flame, the sacred fire that connected him to his ancestors, to the great dragons who had once commanded respect across the stars. In that moment, he felt more like himself than he had since the day his world burned. "Better?" Sarah asked, stowing her equipment. "Much." Zephyr turned to face her properly, drawing himself up to his full height, which admittedly wasn't impressive by most standards, but carried dignity nonetheless. "I am Prince Zephyr, last of the White-Scale lineage, keeper of the ancient songs, and apparently your property according to galactic law." Sarah's expression hardened. "You're not my property. You're under my protection. There's a difference, a distinction that may be lost on the Hegemony Council, and their enforcement arm," Zephyr replied. "They classified my people as non-sentient specifically to strip us of legal protections. In their eyes, I'm an animal you purchased." "Then they're about to learn something about human perspectives on animal cruelty," Sarah said with quiet menace. "But first, I need to understand exactly what happened to you. How did the last prince of a dragon lineage end up in chains on an auction block?" Zephyr felt old pain lance through his chest. "That, Sarah Chun, is a story of betrayal, genocide, and the casual cruelty of those who mistake might for right. Are you certain you wish to hear it?" Sarah settled into a nearby chair with the patience of someone prepared for a long conversation. "My father taught me that you can't fix a problem until you understand all its dimensions. Tell me everything." And so, in the cramped confines of human worship disguised as a civilian craft, the last prince of the White-Scale dragons began to tell the story of how his people had been betrayed, hunted, and ultimately erased from the galaxy's memory. It was a tale that would explain much about why the auction hall had gone so quiet when a human woman stepped forward to claim him, and why intelligence services across 3 sectors were already taking notice of the unusual transaction. But more than that, it was the beginning of a partnership that would teach the galaxy something about human nature that no military victory or diplomatic coup had yet managed to convey. That humanity's most dangerous trait wasn't their adaptability, their technology, or even their legendary stubbornness. It was their tendency to adopt lost causes and make them personal. The ship's chronometer showed they had been in hyperspace for 6 hours, but Zephyr's story had carried them across decades of galactic history. Sarah listened without interruption, her pale eyes never leaving his face as he recounted the systematic destruction of everything he had once held dear. The White-Scale Dominion controlled 17 systems at our height. Zephyr continued, his small form silhouetted against the viewport where stars streaked past like tears of light. We were not conquerors in the traditional sense. Our power came from knowledge, stellar cartography that could navigate the deep void, weather magic that could calm solar storms, and diplomatic wisdom accumulated over millennia. Other species came to us for guidance, not because we forced them to, but because we had seen the rise and fall of empires while they were still discovering fire. Sarah poured herself another cup of coffee from the ship's modest galley, a habit she'd inherited from too many long watches in patrol ships. What changed? The Hegemony Council's expansion reached our borders. At first, the contact was peaceful. We offered them the same guidance we had given countless others, warnings about unstable wormholes, advice on managing multi-species colonies, mediation for trade disputes. We asked for nothing in return except the respect due to ancient wisdom. Zephyr's golden eyes dimmed as he continued. But the council had grown drunk on conquest. They had absorbed 47 species into their collective, either through diplomacy backed by overwhelming force or through simple annexation. To them, every independent system represented a challenge to their authority. They couldn't conceive of coexistence with equals. So they moved against you. Not immediately. They were too clever for direct assault. The dragons were few in number. My entire species numbered perhaps 10,000 souls across 17 worlds, but our defensive capabilities were formidable. A single mature dragon could hold a planet against invasion fleets, and our youngest could pilot ships through stellar phenomena that would destroy conventional vessels. Open war would have been costly. Sarah set down her cup with deliberate care. They found another way. Ambassador Vexhai of the Slithen Hegemony requested a formal audience with our Dragon Council. He came with gifts, treaties, and proposals for mutual prosperity. He spoke of trade agreements that would bring our peoples closer together, of cultural exchange programs, of shared scientific endeavors that would benefit all participants. Zephyr's voice carried the bitter weight of hindsight. We welcomed him as we had welcomed countless others over the centuries. Classic infiltration protocol, Sarah observed. Get inside the decision-making structure, map the power relationships, identify weaknesses. Precisely. But Vexhai was more thorough than we anticipated. He spent 3 full cycles with us, learning our customs, our traditions, our methods of governance. He was particularly interested in our reproductive cycles and population distribution patterns. We thought it was academic curiosity. Zephyr moved to the viewport, pressing one small claw against the transparent aluminum as if he could touch the stars beyond. Dragons do not reproduce like most species. Our fertility is tied to stellar alignments, planetary magnetic fields, and rituals that must be performed in specific locations at precise times. Vexhai documented everything. Sarah felt a cold understanding begin to form in her stomach. He wasn't planning to conquer your worlds. He was planning to make them uninhabitable for your species. The first sign of trouble came when our outer colonies began reporting unusual stellar activity. Solar flares that disrupted our navigation, magnetic anomalies that interfered with our reproduction cycles, gravitational distortions that made atmospheric flight dangerous for our kind. We initially attributed it to natural phenomena. Even ancient civilizations can be caught off guard by cosmic events. But it wasn't natural. No, the hegemony had deployed stellar manipulation devices based on the information Vexi had gathered. They knew exactly which types of environmental disruption would impact dragon physiology most severely. Within 2 cycles, 3 of our outer worlds had become effectively uninhabitable for my people, though other species could survive there without difficulty. Sarah's jaw tightened. Environmental warfare. Elegant and deniable. The council debated our response for months, while our people suffered. The older dragons advocated for negotiation. Surely this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved through diplomacy. The younger ones called for immediate military action. Zephyr's voice faltered briefly. I supported negotiation. I was young and idealistic. I believed that beings capable of such sophisticated manipulation could surely be reasoned with. What happened when you tried to negotiate? Vexi returned with a delegation of hegemony officials. They expressed shock and concern at the environmental disasters affecting our worlds. They offered humanitarian aid, refugee assistance, and temporary relocation to worlds under hegemony protection. All we had to do was formally request council intervention and accept temporary hegemony administration until the crisis passed. Temporary, Sarah repeated flatly. Nothing is more permanent than a temporary government solution, Zephyr agreed. But by then, we had little choice. 12 of our 17 worlds were becoming uninhabitable. Our population was scattered, our birth rate had dropped to near zero, and our young were dying from environmental exposure. The Dragon Council voted to accept hegemony assistance. Zephyr turned from the viewport to face Sarah directly. Within 6 months, hegemony forces had established permanent bases on all our remaining worlds. They claimed the environmental damage was more extensive than initially assessed and would require years of terraforming to repair. In the meantime, all dragons would be relocated to specially prepared reservations for their own safety. Reservations that happened to be perfect prisons. The hegemony was very thorough. The reservations were on worlds with magnetic fields that disrupted our abilities, atmospheric compositions that left us constantly weakened, and isolation protocols that prevented us from gathering in the numbers necessary for our most powerful rituals. They called it protective custody. We called it slow extinction. Sarah stood and began pacing the small bridge, her movements sharp with controlled anger. How long did this go on? 7 years. 7 years of watching my people slowly waste away, while hegemony scientists studied us like laboratory specimens. They documented our abilities, our weaknesses, our social structures. They learned everything there was to know about dragon physiology and psychology. And then Zephyr's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They changed the law. The sentience classifications. The Hegemony Council passed Resolution 2847, establishing new criteria for sentient species recognition. Population size became a primary factor. Any species with fewer than 50,000 individuals could be reclassified as endangered fauna rather than sentient beings. The resolution was presented as a conservation measure. Species with such small populations clearly needed protection rather than political autonomy. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him with growing horror. They genocide you with paperwork. By the time Resolution 2847 passed, there were fewer than 3,000 dragons left alive. The environmental damage to our reproductive cycles, combined with the stress of captivity and the loss of our ancient nesting sites, had reduced us below the threshold. Legally, we ceased to be people. We became animals. And animals don't have rights. Animals belong to whoever claims them. The Hegemony Council graciously allowed various member species to adopt dragons for research, entertainment, or collection purposes. We were distributed across the galaxy like rare pets. Zephyr's scales seemed to lose some of their luster as he continued. I was given to a Breton research facility that specialized in studying evolved animal intelligence. They kept me in a cage barely large enough to spread my wings, ran cognitive tests on me like I was a clever dog, and published papers on my remarkable but ultimately instinctive problem-solving abilities. How did you end up at the auction? The research facility lost funding when the novelty wore off. Turns out that studying the intelligence of an animal that could discuss quantum mechanics in 17 languages wasn't as compelling to grant committees as they'd hoped. I was sold to a private collector who got bored with me after a few years. He sold me to another collector who sold me to an entertainment promoter who sold me to the auction house when I refused to perform tricks for paying customers. Sarah had stopped pacing and was now standing very still in the way that experienced soldiers did when they were deciding whether to commit violence. How many others are left? I don't know. We've been scattered for so long that contact between survivors is nearly impossible. The hegemony made sure of that. Dragons can share knowledge and power when we're in proximity to each other. Isolation isn't just psychological torture for us, it's spiritual starvation. But you think there are others. I hope there are others. But hope and knowledge are different things. Zephyr looked at Sarah with curiosity that cut through his pain. Why does this matter to you? Your people have enough struggles with the Hegemony Council without taking on the cause of extinct dragon lineages. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stars streaming past the viewport. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. Because my father spent his entire career fighting bullies who used superior firepower to prey on those who couldn't fight back. Because I grew up listening to his stories about species that had been ground under the hegemony's wheels while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. And because she paused, meeting Zephyr's golden gaze. Because 3 months ago, I learned that he'd been keeping a list. A list. Names, locations, and status reports on every wrongfully classified extinct species he could track down. Dragons, yes, but others too. The crystalline collective that was reclassified as decorative minerals. The harmony singers who were redefined as advanced but non-sentient musical instruments. The phase walkers who were declared mythical because they couldn't be consistently detected by hegemony sensors. Sarah's expression hardened. 27 species that had been legally erased from existence while the galaxy watched and did nothing. Zephyr felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Something that might have been hope if he'd dared to name it. Your father kept records of us? More than records. He kept detailed intelligence files, including potential locations of survivors, analysis of the legal mechanisms used to eliminate each species, and preliminary strategic assessments for possible rescue operations. Sarah turned from the viewport to face him fully. He called it his retirement project, something to do after his military service ended that might actually matter. Called past tense. Sarah's composure cracked slightly, revealing the grief she kept locked behind military discipline. Dad died 4 months ago. Heart failure brought on by combat stims he'd been taking for 30 years to keep up with superhuman reaction speeds. The doctor said it was a miracle he'd lasted as long as he did. I'm sorry for your loss, Zephyr said simply, and meant it. He had learned to recognize genuine grief over the course of his captivity. Thank you. But his death isn't the end of his work. He left me everything. His files, his contacts, his resources, and explicit instructions to carry on where he left off. Sarah's voice strengthened as she continued, starting with the easiest case on his list. The purchase of one albino dwarf dragon from a Nexus Station auction. The liberation of Prince Zephyr of the White Scale lineage, Sarah corrected firmly. Dad's intelligence indicated that you were not only one of the most prominent surviving members of your species, but also that your knowledge of ancient draconic sites and rituals would be essential for any systematic rescue effort. Zephyr stared at her in disbelief. You're planning to find the others. We're planning to find the others, Sarah corrected. This isn't a human crusade, Zephyr. This is a joint operation between the last prince of the White Scale dragons and the daughter of humanity's most stubborn general. We're going to find your people, we're going to find the other species on Dad's list, and we're going to remind the galaxy what happens when humans decide that something is worth fighting for. The ship's navigation system chimed softly, indicating their approach to the first waypoint on a journey that would take them across the galaxy. Sarah moved to the pilot station with practiced efficiency, her fingers dancing across controls that would bring them out of hyperspace near a coordinate that existed in no official star charts. "Where are we going first?" Zephyr asked, moving to the co-pilot's position with growing excitement. According to Dad's files, there's a Bredhan Black Site research facility in the Kethmar system. 3 levels of security, minimal staff, and housing for approximately 12 specimens of various extinct species. Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. They're about to receive an unexpected inspection from someone who doesn't believe their research serves the greater good. That's going to be dangerous. Yes, it is. Are you ready for dangerous, Prince Zephyr? The Dragon Prince looked at his reflection in the dark viewport, seeing not the broken captive who had cowered on an auction platform, but something that had been sleeping for too long. Ancient fire kindled in his golden eyes as he felt power begin to flow through channels that had been blocked for years. "I've been ready for dangerous my entire life," he replied. "I just forgot for a while." As the ship dropped out of hyperspace near the edge of the Kethmar system, 2 beings who had every reason to be enemies began planning the liberation of creatures the galaxy had written off as extinct. Neither of them realized that their conversation had been monitored by intelligence services across 3 sectors, or that their small ship was already being tracked by forces that had invested considerable time and effort in maintaining the current order. The Hegemony Council had worked very hard to bury the species on General Chen's list. They were about to discover that some graves are too shallow and some secrets refuse to stay dead, especially when the people digging them up had learned strategy from humanity's most dangerous soldier and tactics from the last prince of a lineage that remembered when honor still meant something. The Kethmar system hung in space like a forgotten afterthought. 3 dead worlds orbiting a dying star that barely provided enough energy to sustain life. It was the perfect location for activities that required both secrecy and isolation, far from trade routes, uninhabited by any species the Hegemony Council officially recognized, and shrouded in the kind of bureaucratic obscurity that made unwanted questions disappear. Sarah brought the Retribution to a dead stop behind the system's outermost planet, a frozen ball of rock that provided excellent cover for their approach. Her ship's passive sensors painted a detailed picture of the facility on Kethmar 3, a modest surface installation that appeared to be nothing more than a research outpost, connected by heavily shielded conduits to a vast underground complex that definitely didn't appear on any public records. 67 life signs, she reported, reading the sensor data with practiced efficiency. 43 Bredhan personnel, 12 that register as various non-standard biometrics, and 12 more that the sensors can't properly classify. "The unclassifiable ones will be the prisoners," Zephyr said from the co-pilot's seat. His golden eyes burned with anticipation as he studied the facility schematics. Bredhan sensors are calibrated for known species. Anyone who's been genetically manipulated or comes from a species they've declared extinct won't register properly. Sarah nodded grimly. According to Dad's intelligence, this facility specializes in what they call cognitive evolution research. They take members of supposedly extinct species and study how their mental capabilities developed under stress. Torture, in other words. Enhanced interrogation with scientific oversight, Sarah corrected with heavy sarcasm. Much more civilized than simple torture. She activated the ship's stealth systems, watching as their sensor signature faded to background radiation. The Retribution had been extensively modified with technology that existed in the gray areas between legal and highly illegal. Sensor dampeners that made them invisible to most detection systems, communication scramblers that could black out entire sectors, and weapon systems that definitely weren't supposed to be available to civilian vessels. "The plan is simple," Sarah continued as they began their approach to the planet's surface. "We go in quiet, extract the prisoners, and leave before anyone realizes we were there. If possible, we also grab any research data that might help us locate other facilities. And if it's not possible to stay quiet," Sarah's smile could have frozen plasma. "Then, we remind the Bredhan research staff why my father's enemies used to have trouble sleeping at night. The approach to Kethmar 3 took 4 hours, during which they refined their infiltration plan and prepared equipment for what could range from a simple stealth extraction to a full-scale assault. Sarah had packed for both possibilities, and as Zephyr watched her methodically check weapons, explosives, and electronic warfare gear, he began to understand that General Chin's daughter had inherited more than just his strategic mind. "You've done this before," he observed as she assembled a plasma rifle with the ease of long practice. "Similar operations. Dad believed that the best way to understand your enemy was to study their methods firsthand. I spent my teenage years helping him investigate hegemony black sites, illegal research facilities, and the occasional slave market that thought it could operate in human space." Sarah's hands never paused in their work as she spoke. "It's remarkable how much you can learn about a species by observing how they treat those who can't defend themselves. And what did you learn about the Breton? That they're methodical, patient, and absolutely convinced of their own moral superiority. They genuinely believe that their research serves the greater good, which makes them more dangerous than simple sadists. You can negotiate with sadists. They understand concepts like pain and self-interest. True believers only understand force." The planet's surface was a desolate landscape of crystalline formations and frozen atmosphere that made Zephyr grateful for the environmental suit Sarah had provided. They set down the Retribution in a natural cave formation 12 kilometers from the research facility, using gravitational dampeners to ensure their landing wouldn't register on seismic sensors. Moving across Kethmar 3's surface required careful navigation around sensor clusters that monitored for unauthorized biological activity. Sarah led the way with the confidence of someone who had studied the facility's blueprints until she could navigate them blind, while Zephyr followed with growing amazement at her thoroughness. Every step had been planned, every contingency considered, every possible complication addressed with multiple backup solutions. "Your father taught you well," he murmured as they paused at the edge of the facility's outer perimeter. "Dad's first rule of military operations: hope for the best, plan for the worst, and always have an exit strategy that doesn't depend on anything going right." Sarah activated a scanning device that painted detailed images of the facility's interior layout on her helmet display. "Right now, we're looking at best-case scenario. Shift change happened 30 minutes ago. Most of the research staff is asleep, and security is running on skeleton crew." The facility's outer defenses were designed to prevent large-scale assault rather than infiltration. Sensor networks that could detect approaching fleets, energy barriers that could stop orbital bombardment, and automated defense systems calibrated for military-grade threats. But all of that impressive firepower was nearly useless against two people who approached on foot using stealth technology designed by someone who understood exactly how hegemony detection systems worked. They reached the facility's service entrance without triggering a single alarm. Sarah produced a device that looked like a standard maintenance tool, but hummed with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. "Breton security systems are excellent," she explained as the device interfaced with the facility's network, "but they're also standardized across their entire infrastructure. Dad spent 20 years learning to crack them." The locks disengaged with barely a whisper of sound. They were inside. The facility's interior was clean, sterile, and designed with the kind of utilitarian efficiency that prioritized function over comfort. Corridors lined with observation windows, laboratories equipped with restraint systems that could accommodate a dozen different body types, and holding cells that had been carefully engineered to contain beings whose capabilities were supposedly only theoretical. "The prisoners will be in the lower levels," Zephyr whispered, reading facility schematics from Sarah's display. "Maximum security, minimum outside interference, and close to the laboratories for easy transport." They descended through the facility's levels, past dormitories where Breton researchers slept peacefully, past laboratories filled with equipment that would have given nightmares to anyone who understood its purpose, past storage areas containing biological samples that represented the last remnants of species the galaxy had forgotten. The holding cells were exactly where Zephyr had predicted they would be. 12 chambers, each designed for a different type of prisoner, each currently occupied by creatures that had been officially declared extinct decades ago. In the first cell, Sarah found a member of the Crystalline Collective, a being of living mineral that pulsed with internal light despite the neural suppressors that wrapped around its core structure. In the second, something that might once have been a harmony singer, its vocal cords surgically altered to prevent the hypersonic frequencies that had once been capable of shattering starship hulls. In the third, a phase walker whose ability to shift between dimensions had been chemically blocked, leaving it trapped in painful solidity. Each cell told the same story. Beings who had once commanded respect across the galaxy, reduced to test subjects for research that served no purpose beyond satisfying scientific curiosity and maintaining political control. "We can't save them all," Sarah said quietly as they surveyed the prison complex. "Not in one trip. The life support requirements alone would overtax the retribution systems." "Then we prioritize," Zephyr replied, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "Who can we move safely, and who has the knowledge we need to find the others?" The decision was as tactical as it was heartbreaking. They could extract 4 prisoners immediately, those whose physiological requirements were compatible with the ship's life support systems and whose conditions were stable enough for transport. The others would have to wait for a larger rescue operation. Sarah moved through the extraction with military precision, disabling security systems, neutralizing surveillance equipment, and preparing their chosen rescues for transport. The Crystalline Collective member came first, its mineral structure making it relatively easy to move despite its size. The phase walker was next, though the chemical suppressors in its system required careful neutralization to prevent cellular damage. The third prisoner was something Sarah's father's files had listed as void-touched, a member of a species that existed partially outside normal space-time, trapped in containment fields that prevented it from accessing the dimensional buffers that kept its kind alive. The fourth was perhaps the most remarkable of all, a young dragon, barely past adolescence, whose silver scales marked her as a member of a lineage that had supposedly been extinct for over a century. "Lyra," Zephyr whispered as he saw the silver dragon for the first time, "of the storm scale lineage. I thought your entire family had perished in the initial environmental attacks." The silver dragon raised her head weakly, golden eyes focusing with difficulty through the haze of chemical suppressors. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that marked all draconic speech, but it was roughened by captivity and abuse. "Prince Zephyr," she whispered in high draconic, "but you were supposed to be dead." The researchers said all the royal lines had been eliminated. "Researchers lie," Zephyr replied gently, moving to disable the restraints that held her. "How long have you been here?" 3 cycles, perhaps 4. Time becomes meaningless when they keep you sedated between testing sessions. Lyra's gaze shifted to Sarah with confusion. "Who is the human? Why does she move like a warrior?" "She is Sarah Chun, daughter of General Marcus Chun, and she has come to set us free." Zephyr's voice carried a pride that surprised even him. "The humans have not forgotten us, even if the rest of the galaxy has." The extraction took 2 hours of careful work. Each prisoner required different handling procedures, different life support accommodations, and different medical interventions to counteract the effects of their captivity. Sarah worked with the focused intensity of a combat medic, while Zephyr provided knowledge about non-human physiology that proved essential for several of the more complex cases. They were preparing to leave when the facility's alarm systems finally activated. Not because of anything they had done, but because a regularly scheduled check of the holding cells had revealed 4 empty chambers and security footage that showed their infiltration. "So much for the quiet extraction," Sarah muttered, checking her weapons as Bredhan's security forces began mobilizing throughout the facility. "Can we fight our way out?" Zephyr asked, helping to secure the rescued prisoners for transport. "We could try, but our primary objective is getting these people to safety, not starting a war with the entire Bredhan security apparatus." Sarah activated her communication systems, sending a coded signal to the Retribution. "The ship's automated systems will bring her in for pickup, but we need to reach the surface." Fighting their way out of the research facility proved to be more challenging than fighting their way in had been. Breton security forces were methodical and professional, using containment protocols designed to trap intruders rather than simply eliminate them. They sealed corridors, activated energy barriers, and deployed capture nets that could immobilize most known species. But they weren't prepared for the combination of human tactical improvisation and draconic fury that Sarah and Zephyr brought to bear against them. Sarah fought like her father had trained her, efficiently, ruthlessly, and with an understanding of Breton psychology that let her anticipate their responses before they made them. She used their own security systems against them, turning their energy barriers into weapons and their capture nets into obstacles for pursuing forces. Zephyr fought like a dragon prince, remembering what he was. The months of captivity fell away as ancient fire blazed through his veins, and abilities that had been suppressed by runic chains flowed freely for the first time in years. He called forth winds that could shatter equipment, summoned flames that could melt through security barriers, and moved with the aerial grace that made dragons nearly impossible to pin down in combat. Together, they carved a path through the facility's defensive systems, carrying their rescued companions toward the surface, while Breton security forces tried desperately to contain a situation that had escalated far beyond their training protocols. They reached the surface to find the Retribution descending through Kethmar 3's thin atmosphere, her stealth systems disabled in favor of speed and firepower. The ship's weapon systems lit up the frozen landscape as she provided covering fire for their extraction, demonstrating capabilities that definitely weren't standard on civilian vessels. "Get them aboard," Sarah shouted over the sound of plasma weapons and exploding ice formations. "I'll hold the exit." The evacuation took precious minutes while Breton reinforcements poured out of the facility's entrances. Sarah stood her ground like a force of nature, her weapons and tactical positioning keeping an entire security force at bay, while 4 beings who had been given up for dead were loaded onto a human ship and carried toward freedom. When the last of the rescued prisoners was safely aboard, Sarah and Zephyr followed them up the Retribution's loading ramp. The ship lifted off immediately, her engines screaming as she climbed toward escape velocity while surface-to-air defenses tried to lock onto her signature. But the Retribution was fast, well-shielded, and piloted by someone who had learned evasive maneuvers from the galaxy's most paranoid general. They broke atmosphere and jumped to hyperspace before the facility's defenses could coordinate an effective response. As the ship settled into the rhythm of hyperspace travel, Sarah looked around at the 4 beings they had rescued from what amounted to a galactic torture chamber. Each of them represented a species that had been written off, forgotten, consigned to history by the casual cruelty of bureaucratic genocide. "This is just the beginning," she told them as medical systems began the long process of treating injuries and reversing the effects of their imprisonment. "There are 8 more facilities like this one, and 23 more species on our list. We're going to find every one of them, and we're going to remind the galaxy that extinction is a choice, not an inevitability." Zephyr looked at the silver dragon who was slowly recovering her strength, at the crystalline collective member whose internal light was beginning to brighten, at the phase walker who was tentatively testing its ability to shift between dimensions, and at the void touched who was reconnecting with the cosmic currents that sustained its kind. "Your father would be proud," he told Sarah quietly. "My father would say this is the easy part," Sarah replied, checking star charts for their next destination. "Wait until we try to convince the galaxy that these people deserve justice rather than just rescue." The ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying its precious cargo toward a rendezvous with forces that were gathering in the deep spaces between stars. Word was spreading through networks that existed outside official channels, carried by beings who remembered when honor still mattered and when the strong protected the weak rather than preying upon them. The Hegemony Council had spent decades ensuring that certain species remained extinct. They were about to discover that reports of those extinctions had been greatly exaggerated, and that the human tendency to adopt lost causes had found its perfect expression in a partnership between a general's daughter and the last prince of a dragon lineage that remembered when justice was more than just a word.